Good evening. My name is Dr. Jessica Gardner, and it is with great pleasure as the University Librarian for Cambridge that I'm going to introduce you to the Sandars reader for 2017-18, Dr. Peter Wothers. Peter's a teaching fellow in the Department of Chemistry and a fellow and director of studies in chemistry at St Catherine's College here, where we are tonight. Besides lecturing to the first, second and third year undergraduates in natural science here at Cambridge, I hope there might be some of you in the audience today, he's involved in a number of projects bridging the transition between sixth form, school and university, and indeed public engagement in science. Dr. Wothers' special interest in chemistry began at a young age and has led to what he calls, in his own words, an addiction of collecting antique books over a period of 30 years, some of which we will see on display this evening over a glass later. Dr. Wothers has co-authored a number of popular undergraduate textbooks, including Why Chemical Reactions Happen, Chemical Structure, and Reactivity and Organic Chemistry. He's also made a number of TV and radio appearances, including presenting the Royal Institution Christmas lectures, The Modern Alchemist, on the BBC in 2012. Dr. Wothers has been heavily involved in both the national and international chemistry Olympiad competitions, and he has also initiated the successful Cambridge Chemistry Challenge, supported by his own college here at St Catherine's. And in 2014, very, very deservedly, I think you'll agree, he was awarded an MBE for services to chemistry. Now, many of you may be aware, but for those who are not, the Sandars Lectures are considered to be one of the major British bibliographic lecture series, and they were instituted first in 1895. There's a really honourable tradition here for us at Cambridge. They came to being following a bequest from Samuel Sandars, who was a great bibliophile in his own right, and a benefactor to Cambridge University Library and several other Cambridge institutions. We're very proud and grateful for his generous benefaction to us. From that has come a really successful series of lectures. And apart from a brief suspension during the two Great Wars, they've been held annually since 1895. And if I've counted correctly, and there are a lot of them, Dr. Peter Wothers is the 110th Sandars lecturers to accept that invitation. We're so proud you did. Dr. Wothers has taken as his theme chemical attractions, and this evening he begins with the spark. Tomorrow, with more explosions, I believe, will be hydrogen pistols at dawn. Miss that at your peril. And the series will conclude on Thursday with women and children's firsts. I'm really looking forward to all three of them. I hope you'll join us for all three and bring friends too. It's therefore with really great pleasure that I formally invite Dr. Wothers to deliver this year's Sandars Lecture.
Well, thank you very much. Firstly, I must thank the University Librarian for the kind introduction and say what a great honour it is to have been invited to be the 110th Sandars reader. It is quite humbling to look back at the list of very distinguished former holders of this position. However, over the last 123 years, there do not seem to have been that many scientific themes, so I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to bring something slightly different today. Having said that, I was delighted to see in the ranks of the previous Sandars readers lecturing on a scientific topic a former fellow of my own college, St Catherine's, and this was Dr. Sidney Smith, who spoke on the Darwin collection in Cambridge University Library in 1966, which sadly I missed on account of not being born at the time. But this leads me to one of my concerns, actually, at being asked to give this prestigious series of lectures. I was worried, perhaps, that I was too young. So, well, why so? Well, our previous reader, Professor Toshi Takamaya, gave his reflections on 50 years of collecting, and I haven't been around that long. But I must thank the University Librarian again for not inviting me to give the talk next year instead of this. But I think it is true to say that I have felt that age has been a bit of a problem in the past, sadly less so now, but dealers still tend to be slightly surprised that I lack the chronological maturity of their usual clients. I remember once being asked by a suspicious dealer is in a position to afford this book? To which the honest answer must have been a fairly solid no. Sadly, on an academic's salary, there have always been this sort of natural hindrance to my collecting ambitions. But as I will discuss, it is possible to find some pretty amazing things in this day. In fact, in many ways, it's perhaps more so now than ever before. So I have been gradually forming a library of books that interest me, and even though I've only been at it for 30 years, I have found a few treasures along the way. Hopefully, though, I might have another 30 years, and that my collection may eventually turn into something significant, so that people looking back at the list of former Sandars readers might understand why this young interloper was included in their ranks. A few words about today's lecture. I shall spend some time talking about how I got started collecting early works on chemistry. I shall mention some of the books acquired at key stages along the way, but we will then explore in more detail a particular item that I stumbled upon. First, well, what attracted me to chemistry? Well, I think it was things like this. And I have a little demo here, 2 bottles. This is definitely not one that says "drink me" on it, but anyway. So I hope this works. Pressure. So let's just mix these 2 together, and then hopefully you should be seeing a reaction. Or maybe not. Oops. There we are. Suddenly. Yes. Not bad. There was meant to be a longer delay, but there we go. Okay. Anyway. A beautiful change in colour, which I think is rather nice. And it was these changes in colours that actually fascinated me from a really early age. A simple chemical reaction like that seems to be like utter magic. Chemistry gives us a way of understanding the world around us at a level that we can really interact with. I think maybe different from physics in some way. Understanding materials such as wood, plastics, glass, or molecules such as the gases in the atmosphere, or medicines and how they work. I got hooked pretty early on and pressured my parents into giving me chemistry sets for Christmas, which eventually led me to build up a pretty impressive home laboratory. This all naturally led to me buying second-hand chemistry books from a slightly odd shop in Bedford, where I was at school. At the recent book fair in Cambridge, I was speaking to a dealer who also used to visit this shop, and he reminded me of something that I had entirely forgotten. And this was how the owner was never really keen on browsers. Immediately on entering, you had to tell him exactly what you were looking for, okay? You could never say, "Oh, I'm just looking, thanks." He certainly made the first customer feel quite unwelcome. Nonetheless, he did have a modest section on chemistry, and I used to buy second-hand textbooks from him to read on my daily bus journey to school. But then on one visit, I bought a little book that started it all off, and this is this one, Bidlake's Chemistry. This is not a particularly rare book, and it is much later than the books that I'm usually now interested in. But nonetheless, this is the book that started it all off for me. I think I must have paid something like £2 for it at the time. But why did I buy it? I was usually buying second-hand textbooks to learn more about chemistry. But this one was different. Perhaps the first thing that attracted me to the book were the charming pictures. They encouraged the reader to perform little experiments in their home laboratory, something that I loved doing. But then what I really found fascinating was the fact that the chemistry was all wrong. The book contained chemical formulae, but the formula for water was written HO. And for the non-chemists, that's not right, okay? Why do they think this was the case? But then again, how do we know that it is H2O? And I must say, actually, we have a chap who's written a book on that. Where is he? Where's Hassock? They're right at the front there, who can tell you the answer to that later. But anyway, this is one of the things that got me interested, the wrong formulae, the wrong chemistry in this book. But then there was also the list of the known elements. Most were fine, but included in italics were some that it described as being the rarer elements. But these included pilopium, norium, ilmenium, and didymium. Being a keen young student of chemistry, one of my greatest possessions and one of my favourite birthday presents was a beautiful periodic table of the elements that hung on a wall above my bed. Each element was shown with a picture and description of its properties and uses. I knew that these rare elements were not on my table, so what were they? Thus began a quest that took many years to find the answers to. I tried to buy other older books whenever I could find them. In an old bookshop in Northampton, I found a copy of this History of Chemistry from 1898. Such a beautiful book. Thick quality paper with uncut pages and the contemporary binding. And I also bought more up-to-date The Development of Modern Chemistry, shown here. But what particularly attracted me to these were the fine pictures, reproductions from the classics of the subject. I loved looking at these engravings showing elaborate pictures of apparatus being used in distillations or to prepare gases. But my first really exciting purchase was made on arriving in Cambridge as an undergraduate 30 years ago. At the time, Cambridge had many second-hand and rare bookshops around the town, but it was in David's that I found a book by none other than Sir Humphrey Davy himself. And I was so excited. I can't tell you. To be fair, it was only a third edition of his agricultural chemistry and not something that I'd particularly get excited about now. In fact, I have yet to buy a copy of the first edition of this. There are plenty available and there are many rarer things to buy. But at the time, it was amazing. This was a real piece of history. It was written by one of our most famous scientists and published during his lifetime. This object itself had survived throughout to our time, bringing his ideas from that period with it. I was absolutely hooked. I remember sitting at my matriculation dinner in St. Catherine's and telling my neighbour about this fantastic book that I'd bought. Looking back, he must have been a chemistry research fellow here at the time. And I was a little bit surprised and maybe a little bit disappointed that he wasn't quite as excited as I was. But a book that was to have a large influence on me was Humour and Humanism in Chemistry by Professor John Reed, published in 1947. Reed was an organic chemist who trained in Cambridge under William Jackson Pope between 1908 and 1916, before moving to the University of Sydney and finally to St Andrews University. His book is a delightful tour through the history of chemistry and some of its most exciting, interesting texts. What I found particularly appealing were the 17th century books, when chemistry was beginning to become the science that we know today. I was immediately attracted to the beautiful woodcuts from the texts of Lemery and Lefebvre. I think it was this work that brought to my attention some of the real classics in the history of chemistry and was to influence my later collecting, as we shall see. I really enjoyed Reed's book and sought out others by him, including his earlier publication, Prelude to Chemistry. I was delighted to find a signed copy of this book, formerly from his old university at St Andrews, and I hope it wasn't sort of stolen from there. But this book was also great fun, but it was more concerned with alchemical works. Two that especially captivated me from the book were Michael Mayer's Atalanta Fugiens from 1617 and the Viridarium Chemicum of Daniel Stolzius from 1624. Both of these were beautiful alchemical emblem books. Another was the Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum of Ashmole from 1652. Described as the most important English alchemical work, it's a collection of early works all written in verse. Occasionally, I've had a slight flirtation with alchemy books, but in many ways, I find them less interesting, possibly because I can't understand them. I'm afraid that they often appear as complete gibberish, and being a literal-minded scientist, I miss the clear chemical instructions. However, Jennifer Rampling, formerly from the HPS department here, and now an associate professor at Princeton, is slowly beginning to persuade me that there may be some sense of in some of their procedures, and we're planning a collaboration to recreate some of the experiments. But back to the collecting. Other relatively small purchases followed, as and when I came across them. in what was at one time what I hesitate to describe as a bookshop down St. Eligius's Street. Actually, it was no more than a little outhouse used as a bookstore. But I found a 2-volume copy of Dialogues in Chemistry. What I now realise is actually quite a rare book. According to Copac, only the National Library of Scotland has a copy with both volumes, and Manchester has volume 1 only. My fellow students thought that I was mad, spending so much money, £30, on the books, but I thought that they were utterly delightful. As we see here, the books were dedicated to the learned and eloquent Professor of Chemistry at the Royal Institution, Humphrey Davy, Esquire. And the language used in the books was absolutely captivating. It was all, Mr. Davy thinks this, or Mr. Davy thinks that. And this just emphasised to me that these were living items from history. While still a student, I used to attend book fairs in London. This was an excellent opportunity of meeting specialist dealers and occasionally finding the odd bargain. One item that sticks out was a fine set of Fourcroy's A General System of Chemical Knowledge and its applications to the phenomena of nature and art. This is a set of 10 or 11 volumes, depending on whether the index is bound separately, together with a rare, large set of synoptic tables, which give an excellent account of the chemistry of that period. It's been suggested that these tables are particularly uncommon, since being single-sided, they may have been pasted onto the walls of classrooms. But then, one summer, David's had another book by Davy. This one was quite expensive, at £550, and I had to spend my summer working for the conference trade in college, washing plates in the kitchens, in order to gradually pay for it. But this is a lovely book, his Elements of Chemical Philosophy, from 1812, and one that I still regularly use, since it is one in which Davy is still grappling with the nomenclature that we use today, and this is an area that I'm particularly interested in. But curiously, my part-time job led to a little confusion at one book fair. I explained that I was interested in early chemistry books, since I was a chemist myself. I also said that I was doing some part-time work washing plates. I couldn't work out why the dealer, this was Graham Weiner, from whom I bought quite a few books over the years, seemed slightly less impressed and said that he did not approve of plate washing. Whilst I had strange visions of him always eating off dirty crockery, it later occurred to me that he thought that I was using my chemical skills to clean the plates from books. Something, of course, that I would also generally not approve of. But then finally came my first, for me, really big purchase. And this was a book over £1,000. This book came from an extraordinary bookseller, Peter Eaton, at Lily's in Aylesbury. So Eaton, who died in 1993, was a rather eccentric dealer, said to bear a resemblance to his friend, the former Labour leader, Michael Foot. Initially based in London, Eaton had acquired so many books that he had to keep them in warehouses spread across the city. Eventually, in 1969, he bought a dilapidated country house and filled 33 rooms of the house with the books that he'd accumulated. And he must have formed what must have been one of the largest second-hand rare bookstores in the UK. In addition to the books, the house was also filled with oddities in display cases, such as the World War II ration book of George VI, what was described as the first TV cathode ray tube, Empress Josephine's wedding dress, and a collection of 18th century condoms. In the room, though, devoted to his rare books, I found my first really famous chemistry book. This is Dalton's A New System of Chemical Philosophy. This was a real classic of a book, and I knew from my books on the history of chemistry that this was so. It was first announced, in this book, it first announces the atomic theory, suggesting that atoms of the elements combine in simple proportions to form molecules, although he also called these atoms. The plates with his famous symbols of the chemical elements are also often reproduced. Since Dalton liked simplicity, he assumed that water must be made up of an atom of hydrogen and an atom of oxygen, and this was most likely the origin of HO formula in the Bidlake. Here is a close-up of some of the symbols that he used with their modern meanings now. You'll notice that some of the so-called elements, such as magnesia, lime, soda, etc., these are not actually elements at all. In fact, as we shall see in later lectures, it was appreciated that they probably were most likely substances, but nonetheless they were still included since at the time they had not yet been broken down into their true components. Dalton's book has a rather convoluted publishing history. Part 1, with pages up to 220, appeared in 1808, with the second part, pages 221 to 560, appearing in 1810. A second edition of Part 1 appeared in 1842, and a first part of Volume 2 appeared in 1827, but by this time the whole work was completely out of date. This last volume is far more uncommon than the others. Both Pembroke and the Whipple Library, for instance, have the first two parts of Volume 1, just like the set I bought from Peter Eaton. In addition to these, the UL and St John's also has Volume 2. I bought another set in 2005, comprising of the second edition of Part 1, which I didn't have, and the first and only part of Part 2, which I also had a copy before. But most importantly, this also included the rare second volume from 1827. And this Volume 2 has the most unbelievable print in history. Remember, it finally came out in 1827, but in the preface, Dalton tells us, the work now submitted to the public was begun to be printed in 1817, and the 13th and 14th sections, containing the oxides and sulphurets, were printed off before the end of October of the same year. The printing of the rest of the work to the appendix was finished in September 1821. One sheet of the appendix was printed at the end of 1823. But no addition was afterwards made till May 1826, when the printing was resumed and has been continued to the present time. It may be asked, what were the motives for such a plan of procedure? To this, it may be replied that soon after the publication of the first volume, in 1810, I began to prepare materials and to institute experiments relating to the oxides, etc., with occasional diversions into other departments of chemistry, as circumstances arose. As a great portion of my time was always necessarily engaged in professional duties, and as that part of the work I was about to commence was one running into detail, I thought it would be best to print it as I proceeded, whilst the train of thought of the experiments was fresh in mind. He later concedes, it is true that the time the work has been in the press has far exceeded my expectation. Notwithstanding this, I am not conscious of any very material alterations or additions which I should wish to make at the present moment. He later adds, my present design is to add a second part to this volume, and with that to finish the work. It will consist of the most complex compounds, acids and other products of the vegetable kingdom, salts, etc. will form the principal parts. Already I have a stock of experiments on these subjects, but I am not satisfied without exploring this region afresh. And this was dated 1827. Now, with this extremely irregular printing history, it's not surprising that errors crept in. A tiny error was made on the final page of this very preface. In my copy, and in some others that I've seen, this is numbered page VI, or 6, whereas it should be page 8, and is correctly numbered as such in most copies. On the second page of the addenda added to the appendix, we find, by a mistake of the printer, the following paragraphs were omitted after page 308. 3 pages of an additional material are then given. However, a far more serious error arose. In my copy, as in the copy described by William Cole in his excellent bibliography, and in one other copy that I've come across, pages 289 to 296 are missing entirely. Now, the book is published in small quarto format, so these pages make up one printed sheet. However, the collation is formally complete, with pages 281 to 88 comprising quire NN, but quire OO being pages 297, so it's missing up to 304, missing these 8 pages. Now, in the UL and in St John's Library copies, and most others, these pages are present in a quire also labelled NN, but with a 2 handwritten in ink. So I don't quite know where this puts my copy, whether it's more sought after or less sought after for being incomplete, I don't know, but it is interesting nonetheless. So although his book first appeared in 1808, the first announcement of Dalton's theory, together with some of his symbols, actually appeared in the 3rd edition of Thomas Thomson's System of Chemistry the year before. This work is the first extensive treatise of chemistry written in Britain. It went through 7 editions in English, and curiously, our university library has every edition except the 3rd, the only one to feature Dalton's work. I mentioned in passing the excellent bibliography of William Cole. William, or Bill Cole, started work as a physicist for Shell, but then served in the US Army during the Second World War. After that, he decided to teach chemistry in high school, which he did for 27 years. He started collecting books in the physical sciences in 1955, but soon began to specialise in chemistry, and then just those books from the 18th and 19th century. His bibliography contains around 1,400 works, mainly from the period 1700 to 1860. He had many highlights in his collection, including some books from Lavoisier's own library. In the late 70s, some 700 of his books were acquired by the University of Wisconsin-Madison Library. Many more of his books and manuscripts joined the collection in the late 90s. A few of his books have appeared on the market, and one is now in my collection. His Bookplate features 2 hard-working putti slaving over a hot furnace in a chemical laboratory. The woodcut Cole based his Ex Libris plate on is from a work by the French chemist Pierre-Joseph Macquer, his Elements de chimie pratique, published in 1751. Interestingly, 2 issues of this work were published in the same year, with the type being completely reset and the charming vignette being recut, and for some reason left looking somewhat less cherubic, I think. In addition to acquiring the core of Cole's collection, Wisconsin had earlier in the 1950s acquired another fantastic collection of chemistry put together by Denis Devine. Devine was born in London in 1910 and began collecting chemistry books whilst a student at Merton College, Oxford. His collecting began in earnest whilst in France, just prior to the Second World War. On hastily leaving for Britain, he left his collection stored in a somewhat precarious location in occupied France. Fortunately, he was able to recover his books after the Allies' victory. He relocated to the States and established the Devine Soap Corporation in New York. After publishing a catalogue of his collection, he sold it to the University of Wisconsin in 1951. At the time, the collection comprised about 3,000 volumes. After compiling his catalogue, Devine continued acquiring additional books not included in his previous collection, with the intention of forming a second library and eventually publishing a second annotated catalogue. However, this collection was eventually sold through the great New York dealer H.P. Krauss in 1953. Devine writes in the introduction to this catalogue of this sale, eventually came the realisation that an attempt to cover the whole literature of chemistry, alchemy, pharmacy and balneology from the 15th century beginnings to the printed word to the close of the 19th century was too vast an undertaking for a private collector. Such a task is best undertaken by scholarly institutions, by universities and research libraries. It is interesting to see some of the highlights in this catalogue. A mint copy of the key work of the Italian chemist Amedeo Avogadro sold for $50. In February this year, a copy made €12,050 at auction. More desirable from my perspective was a copy of the exceedingly rare 1574 first edition of Lazarus Erker's principal work on mining and metallurgy. In 1953, this sold for $925. There is currently a slightly imperfect copy of this work available for $55,000. Sadly, I think I will have to make do with my second edition from 1580, which actually has more of the very beautiful woodcuts, and that's one of the items that's displayed outside. I do have a couple of books once in Devine's possession and featuring his Ex Libris. One particularly fine example is a presentation off-print from the famous chemist Joseph Priestley. This off-print was not listed in either Devine's original catalogue or in the Krauss catalogue, so clearly Devine couldn't resist collecting particularly interesting items after he'd disposed of those collections. Eventually, Devine devoted his attention to collecting the works of Lavoisier and also bought books from the great chemist's library. This was relatively easy at the time. since the Lavoisier's descendants, the Chazelle family, were beginning to sell off their family silver, or at least their books and chemical equipment. Devine bought as much of the material as he could and formed a fabulous collection, which was eventually bought by Cornell University in 1963, after they received a generous donation from an alumnus to make this possible. The item shown here features Devine's bookplate and is an item from Devine's Lavoisier collection, but it is one of the duplicates, which is how I've ended up with it. The other bookplate, by the way, present in this indicates that the book belonged to John Yadkin, who Wikipedia describes as a British physiologist and nutritionist and the founding professor of the Department of Nutrition at Queen Elizabeth College, London. Yadkin was particularly interested in the metabolism of sugars, and his bookplate is a charming cartoon based on the chemical structure of sugar, which I think is really quite nice. In addition to most of Lavoisier's correspondence, Cornell also have around 600 volumes from Lavoisier's personal library. Occasionally, some that haven't yet found their way to the state's surface, and I have ended up with a few of these. One of particular note is a Latin edition of Boyle's work on colours. This was formerly owned by another French chemist, Jean Helot, whose signature is seen on the title page. Lavoisier bought this and a number of other items at auction in 1766 on the death of this chemist. When Lavoisier was executed in the Revolution in 1794, his library was confiscated and it was later returned to his widow and eventually auctioned in 1836. So I'm really quite pleased with this copy. I also have a fine copy of a chemical book by Emanuel Koenig from 1703, and this one is actually signed by Lavoisier as well as having his bookplate, which is rather nice. But now we're jumping ahead a little. The bibliographies of Devine and Cole are really impressive testimonies to the collections that they formed. I remember vividly at the time I first came across Devine's in the Whipple Library. For a brief while, I was completely overwhelmed by how extensive this collection was. What was the point in my collecting? Why was I bothering? Well, this passed almost as quickly as it came. I was not trying to recreate such a collection. This was impossible, since I simply don't have the income. For me, it was more about the love of the subject and the thrill of occasionally finding some wonderful books. So whilst it might be fun thought that even as a subset of the millions of books housed in the great libraries around the world, actually there's no other library anywhere that has the same collections of books that I have. And that's quite nice. But that's not what drives me. For me, it's more being able to pick a book off the shelf at night, take it to bed, and become immersed in the beginnings of the subject that I love. I've said that there's no way that I can compete with some of the really great collections in the past. Well, actually, I think this is wrong. Before I say why, I should mention another really great collection, and that's of the bibliophile Roy G. Neville. Actually, he told me he really used to hate his library being called a collection, but, well, whatever. Anyway, I came aware of Roy through one of my dealers and asked if he would mind forwarding me a letter to him. I thought it would be fun for a young whippersnapper like me to be in contact with someone who formed one of the most impressive chemistry libraries ever assembled by a single individual. Roy was an interesting man. I think it might be best to say that he was of a different generation. He was born in Bournemouth in 1926 and, like me, was fascinated performing chemical experiments at home. Due to drafting during the war, he was not able to take up a place offered at Oxford, instead eventually attending University College Southampton before moving to Oregon in the States, where he did a master's and PhD. Over a period of 60 years, Neville amassed an amazing collection of more than 6,000 volumes. His library was bought by the Chemical Heritage Foundation, now the Science History Institute, in 2004 for $10 million. I went out to visit Roy in 1997 and enjoyed seeing his amazing library. We used to chat every now and then and swap book stories. They usually consisted of him telling me how he managed to purchase such and such a book for very little money several decades ago. But I remember writing in his guest book how I thought it would not be possible to assemble such a collection again. He agreed, adding that the books were simply not available. However, I think we were both wrong. The reason for this was because, of course, a new development that was to come to completely change book collecting and indeed many aspects of all of our lives, and that's the internet. The first book that I purchased on the internet was one that I'd been looking for quite some time, Chemistry No Mystery by John Scoffin. A second-hand bookseller had an incomplete copy that they were offering a while back. I didn't buy it, but instead went to read it at the university library as a fresher undergraduate. And I must admit that when I first went into the rare books room in the university library, it was an utterly amazing experience that I will always remember. And perhaps others here also remember their first time. I felt like a complete fraud, thinking, wow, they let me in here? This is as an undergraduate. Then, wow, they let me handle this really rare book. And it was tremendously exciting, it really was. I must admit, I felt pretty much exactly the same the first time, much later, many years later, when I went into the British Library and was handling some of their unique items that I'd only read about before. Holding these things in your hand thinking, do you know what you've just handed over to me? It was just an incredible experience. So partly because of the fond memories of this time, but mainly because the book is just simply delightful, it remains one of my favourites. And it is one of the books that I learned of in Reid's Humour and Humanism. So it came about that this was the first book that I bought via computer, wondering one day as a student, idly sitting in front of a very clunky computer, thinking, well, what is this internet thing for, and could I use it to find old books? Oh, little did I know. Remarkably, and it really is quite remarkable, pretty much the only thing that came up was an obscure shop in South Africa, and it happened to be selling this book. And I immediately phoned them up and bought it. I was very excited to be able to get a copy at last. I asked if they had any more chemistry, thinking perhaps that this might have been part of a collection. And it was part of a collection, but not of chemistry. Instead of the illustrator, George Cruikshank, best known, of course, for his illustrations of Dickens. Now, a quick browse on Via Libri this afternoon revealed that there is one currently available now, priced around £40. This is a very good buy, but be careful in case you get hooked. I should add, by the way, that when I wrote this a couple of weeks ago, there were two available on this website, and one has now gone. It was indeed a very good buy. This book takes the form of a chemistry tutor, the old philosopher, giving lessons to a class of schoolboys. I'd like to read one of these stories to you to demonstrate why it's one of my favourites. It's a little long, but I hope you'll agree that it's worth it. This is, in fact, I shall have an opportunity here to have a glass of water first. This is the tale about a giant and a dwarf. Of all the merrymakings which it has been my lot to see, none has ever pleased me more as much as a village fair. The Lord Mayor of London's show, the King's visit to Parliament, and all other fine sights put together never afforded me half the gratification that I have felt from being present at a country fair. But my recollections of all country fairs are not pleasant, as will appear in the course of the tale which I shall presently relate, although I am convinced that the chastisement which I then suffered for an act of wanton mischief taught me a useful lesson for my guidance in after life. It taught me in a practical manner something which I had heard theoretically advanced many times before, that knowledge is power, either for good or for evil, and is only conducive to happiness when enlisted on the side of virtue. In the early part of June, some 60 years ago, I was present at the annual fair of my village. I was then about 10 years old. The approach of the fair day was a subject of pleasurable anticipation for everyone within a dozen miles of the place. The village cottages were whitewashed, the rose trees were pruned, the garden walks were nicely weeded and brushed clean from leaves. The cottage doors were painted, and in short, everything was done that could make our homes more comfortable or more neat, for the fair day was one of hospitality to all strangers, and to have received them in negligence or untidiness would have seemed to us the height of ill-breeding. It was a pleasing sight for us boys when perched upon the cottage roofs or seated on the bough of some tall tree to watch the busy preparations which were making for the approaching festivities. Some were employed in partitioning off the village green into square divisions for the cattle. Some were erecting booths for sweetmeats and toys, and some were fixing swings and roundabouts, while in another part of the green the village authorities were in earnest conversation with mountebanks, showmen, conjurers and fruit sellers, respecting the price which each should pay for a certain space of ground. No statesman settling a treaty between nations. No warriors inspecting the field of an approaching battle could look more serious and sedate than these. If their very lives had depended on the termination of conference, they could not have looked more grave. The heads of some were moving from side to side. The heads of others were moving up and down. Some grasped their pockets convulsively and turned on their heels. Some curled their lips and counted their fingers. In short, a careful observer, placed far enough away to be out of hearing, but still within sight, might have seen depicted in their ever-changing gestures all those varieties of feeling which are manifested in the course of mercantile transactions of the most extensive kind. Far beyond this busy scene, the horizon was clouded with rising dust caused by the approaching cattle and caravans. In a short time, they were distinctly visible, and in the space of a few minutes more, we saw them descend the hill immediately opposite to the place of destination. The cattle galloped and frolicked as if they too enjoyed the approaching festivities, and so perhaps they did, for none of them were tired from travelling long, having merely come from adjoining farms. And if they could be pleased with their own fine appearance and experience a little of human vanity in being gazed on and admired, they must have felt pleasure indeed. Be this so or not, they did appear pleased. Why, I cannot tell. Now came donkeys with gingerbread, fruits and toys, carts with mountebank stages, balancing poles, swings and roundabouts. Then followed caravans with wild beasts, penny peeps, giants, dwarfs. Next came the more humble punchinillos, dog-cart men and blind fiddlers, who, having allowed the aristocracy of their craft to advance before, now followed in the rear. The bells all the time continued ringing merrily, and thus passed away the evening. Now I must suppose the night spent, not in sleep, at least by me, for I was too anxious. However, it was spent, and the fair day had arrived, which brings me to the subject of my tale. I am sorry to own that when young, I employed my little stock of scientific knowledge chiefly in playing practical jokes, and this propensity did not entirely leave me until the fair day, which I am about to describe. Scarcely waiting to finish my breakfast, I sallied out with some of my young friends in search of adventures, and passing along a row of show caravans, I was struck with the appearance of a picture representing a giant and a dwarf, who were to be seen inside, together with a boa constrictor and an alligator, all for the sum of 1 penny. Attracted by the harmony of a kettle drum and a cracked trumpet, a larger crowd of spectators surrounded this caravan than any other, and the managers were enjoying in consequence an undue monopoly. The wild beasts men in vain bawled forth the names and nations of their wonderful animals. Punchinello jabbed into the empty air, and the mountebanks danced and grimaced in vain. The giant, dwarf, alligator and boa constrictor were all the rage, and the trumpet and kettle drum drew wondering crowds into the caravan. "I have certainly seen a bigger fellow than he," said a countryman stepping out. "If I bain't be mistaken," continued another, "the fellow's on stilts, and if a body could make him come out onto the ground and show his inches fair and undeceitfully, he would look a wonderfully different man." I do not know how it was, but this conversation aroused in me the most pleasurable sensations. I reasoned myself into a belief that if there was any deceit in the matter, I should act properly in exposing it, by exhibiting the giant in his full proportions. When the mind is bent upon the performance of some mischievous trick, we first quiet conscience by endeavouring to clothe our evil propensities in a garb of virtue. So it was with me. I fancied that by drawing the giant out, I should exhibit any deceit that there might be. And if there should be no deceit, then the giant might walk in again. But my conscience was not quite satisfied upon this point, inasmuch as the dwarf too must certainly experience some inconvenience if my proposed measure should be carried out into execution. Perhaps also the alligator and snake might suffer. However, I determined that the giant should come out, and conscience in vain whispered, "No." Returning home, I selected a basin, provided myself with ingredients for making this disgusting sulphuretted hydrogen, this is hydrogen sulfide, and filling the basin with nuts, better to describe my schemes, I crept stealthily under the giant's caravan, where, having set on the preparation of my gas, I retreated as fast as I could, allowing the noxious stench to ascend through the cracked and separated flooring of the caravan. Standing a little distance on a hillock, I watched the result. "Walk in, ladies and gentlemen," bawled the conductor. Squeak went the trumpet, bang went the kettle drum, but all in vain. The ladies and gentlemen kept walking out instead of walking in. Their faces contorted and their noses compressed. Presently the musicians too left their posts, for the stench was intolerable. Another moment, and the ground was cleared for a space of many yards around the caravan. That is to say, all had left it, but myself, who, standing on the little hillock, was enjoying a sight of the mischief that I had created. Whilst I was one of the crowd, my ecstasies, for aught I knew, might have remained unnoticed. But standing alone, they must necessarily have been remarked, and indeed so they were. Presently, the dwarf gave a convulsive shriek, the giant roared aloud, and bursting from the caravan, with the dwarf clinging tightly round his neck, he jumped from the platform to the ground, where, heaving his great chest and staring wildly around, he looked like an infuriate being from another world. Whether irritated by my laughter or guided by an instinctive sense to the person of his tormentor, I know not. But leaping towards the hillock on which I stood, he snatched me in an instant from the ground. I now repented of my joke, for he clawed and shook me about as a cat does a mouse. A sound drubbing I would have not cared so much about, but the monster almost strangled me. His great hands squeezed me so that I thought every bone in my body was broken. Cry I could not, for he closed my mouth by main force, in order that I might be tortured with greater effect. He did not strike me, it is true. If he had, I think I might have died. And in this forbearance he was generous, well knowing his own immense strength. But having clawed me for a minute or two, he very coolly held me under one arm, my head towards the ground and my feet kicking aloft, while the dwarf on his shoulder was busily engaged in belabouring my back with sides with a cudgel, a task which he executed with great perseverance and effect, exerting at every blow his utmost strength, he not being at all afraid of breaking my bones. Even this treatment was a relief to me, because I could cry. The people were panic-struck, and what with the horrible smell, and what with the fear of the giant, no one came to my assistance. Indeed, I did not deserve that they should. How the rest of the day passed, I know only from hearsay. Feverish and delirious, I found myself 2 days afterwards in bed, surrounded by 2 doctors and a nurse. 6 weeks passed, and I was yet unable to walk from the effects of my squeezes and bruises. However, I suffered no lasting injury, and I have many times since then been thankful that my fondness for practical joking experienced such a timely and salutary check. From what I've been told, the giant really looked as large outside the caravan as he did inside, and he did not require the aid of stilts to increase his height. As to his strength, I can offer personal testimony. So there we go. I thought it was just a delightful little story that, as I say, I really enjoyed reading. The rest of the book is, again, it's not all quite so storytelling, but it's absolutely charming. Incidentally, the only significant accident that I ever had in my own home laboratory involved this same foul-smelling hydrogen sulfide. I was preparing a gas jar of the gas, and it toppled over and stank out the whole house. I was so unpopular. I think it was probably just as well that I didn't tell my parents that the gas was actually more poisonous than hydrogen cyanide. I don't think it would have helped. Actually, part of it is just that we're very sensitive to it, so it probably wasn't actually that dangerous, probably. But that was my very first book bought on the internet. Now, like many other aspects of life, the internet has really changed book collecting. It used to be the case that there were general booksellers and then more specialised ones who generally charged much higher prices. It was like a sort of food chain when presumably the specialists scouted round fairs and auctions, recognising the real gems that they then bought and sold on, doubling the prices en route. What suddenly changed was that now you can type in a title and search sites like ABE Books or Via Libri and find many copies of books that were once thought of as rare. Incidentally, I quite like playing the game with Roy's bibliography of spotting the rare entry that doesn't describe the book as rare. Roy was putting his catalogue together with the intention in the back of his mind of selling the library. So often the descriptions are maybe played up a little, or certainly presented in the best possible light. In addition to almost everything being rare, when he doesn't have the first edition of a book, the second is often described as more complete or the best edition. I should have offered to swap my second edition of Boyle's Sceptical Chemist with his first, since the second contains everything the first does and additional material that doubles the size. Clearly a better book. So now it is much easier to find these rare books. The problem is that even though they may not be as rare as once thought, the prices have not gone down. What has happened is that now all the non-specialist book dealers can easily see the entries from the specialist dealers and essentially just slap on the same descriptions together with the specialist prices. However, the internet has certainly helped find really rare books, and this is why I think Roy was mistaken. I believe that actually, if only I had the money, I could relatively easily assemble a remarkable collection comparable to Roy's in 10 to 20 years. All you need is patience, knowledge, an eagle eye, and to be able to jump in quick when an item surfaces. And of course, lots of cash helps. Surprisingly, I've found that sometimes it's the really rare books that can be the bargains. And this is because only the real specialists who know what they're looking for and recognise it when they see it, might appreciate the worth of a particular title. There are some fairly common rare books out there where the dealers have put on an arbitrary price of sometimes 10 times what I think that book might actually be worth, and I doubt that they will sell. However, I have also had quite a few real gems, probably because the dealer was not entirely sure of exactly what the book was or why it might be interesting. And to be fair, why should they? One interesting little discovery that I made centres around a work by Jean Béguin, a pharmacist from the latter part of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th. Béguin was a native of Lorraine in France. After travelling in Europe, he settled in Paris, where he established a school of pharmacy under the protection of Jean Ribet, the first physician to King Henry IV. There he gave lessons on chemistry that were open to the public, but often attended by medical students. They were lectures on pharmaceutical preparations and operations and were accompanied by technical demonstrations. They probably began in 1604 and continued into Béguin's death around 1619 or 20. In 1610, he published a little book of 70 pages, no more than a pamphlet, for the use of his students so that they might be spared the trouble of copying descriptions. The book is exceedingly rare, with only, I think, 3 copies known, and sadly I don't have one of them. The one reproduced here is from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, but the British Library also has a copy, as does the Glasgow University Library, which houses the fabulous Ferguson collection. As we shall see, James Ferguson, who assembled a fantastic collection of more alchemical works, ended up acquiring some 23 editions of this work, and the authoritative study of the book was inspired by some of his original notes, but was ultimately written by Patterson and published in the Annals of Science in 1937. The title of Béguin's little book translates as The Chemical Beginner, acquired from the fount of nature and manual of experience by its author, who gives and devotes himself and what is his to God, thrice best and greatest. The book was privately printed and only intended to be distributed by the author. The story is described by Béguin in a later edition. The author to the reader, salutation. When, a few years ago, at the request of some medical students and the persuasion of my friends, I set up in this celebrated town of Paris a chemical school where lovers of the hermetic art might practice themselves in its manual operations, it was not only oppressive and troublesome to them to copy out descriptions of preparations, but also most tedious to me to dictate them and have to undergo the same trouble, constantly repeating them as often as new chemical students came. On which account, that day of writing, I indeed might be relieved from the labour of tasks of dictating, and that we might consume uselessly the time of neither, which sometimes was limited to 3 or 4 weeks. I collected into a volume the descriptions of the preparations which I was then accustomed to show, and gave them to a printer for reproduction, on the condition that all copies were to be given to me. But it happened that one of them, I know not how, fell into the hands of a printer of Cologne, and he, ignorant of my plans and without my desire and permission, reprinted the book, but most erroneously, and distributed the printed copies from that place. The result was that everyone very soon guessed at its authorship, not only in France, but elsewhere also. This pirated edition of 1611 is also very rare, with only the Wellcome Library and the British Library listing copies in the UK. Remarkably, though, I managed to find a copy of this edition. This really was an amazing find, and it just goes to show how useful the internet can be. This book came up for auction in a not very well-known Parisian auction house, and remarkably, it didn't sell. I found out about it a few weeks later, and amazingly, I bought it from them, incredibly cheaply. I couldn't believe my luck. In fact, I could not believe that I had actually bought the genuine article until it arrived and was in my hands. And it really is a useful edition, since despite what Began says, it is actually an extremely close copy of the original, even including some of the typos. However, the format and the pagination are different, and it is physically even smaller than the original. This is actually on display outside, as you shall see. Began goes on to say, I was therefore much vexed that those things which I had hurriedly put together for the use of my pupils and issued from time to time, especially what I had written about the descriptions of chemical operations, should have been published. Perhaps one of the reasons that Began was vexed was because he had borrowed some of the text, word for word, from an earlier work by Andreas Libavius. Libavius, whose first academic appointment was as Professor of History and Poetry at the University of Jena, also graduated as a medical doctor and maintained a keen interest in chemistry. According to the great historian of chemistry, J.R. Partington, his most important work was his Alchimia, published in 1597. Like many others, Partington regards this as the first systematic textbook of chemistry. He also describes the book as much rarer than the first edition of Newton's Principia and Boyle's Sceptical Chemist. This may or may not be true, but there do seem to be quite a few copies around, even though it is surprisingly absent from the British Library. My copy came from the wonderful library of the Cambridge scholar Walter Paget, who specialised in the works of Paracelsus. Whilst the largest part of his library was sold at auction, the rarest and most important of his works were given to his son, and it was on the death of him and his wife that the books eventually were sold by the dealer Roger Gaskell. Over a number of years, I've ended up buying quite a few. But back to the story. It was Andrew Kent and Owen Hannaway, chemists from the University of Glasgow, where the Ferguson collection is housed, who first showed in 1960, sorry, a few hundred years out there, in 1960, that several passages from Libavius were copied by Began in his first edition of this little work, notably the section describing techniques and processes. The same passages would feature word for word in Began's book, as seen here, in the section on putrefaction, as you can hopefully spot the similarities there. This would go through one of these Google filters now, of course. Anyway, but whether it was because of this unacknowledged lifting from another source or for another reason, after people began to recognise Began as the author of his book, he resolved, no longer on account of human envy, to bury and hide the talent entrusted me by the wisest and greatest God, but to put it to the interest and usury of teaching and instructing students and eager learners in chemistry, and to encompass the whole subject in my writing. However, clearly not everyone was happy. He tells us, it is incredible how much odium and envy my friendliness towards and my ability to promote the affairs of medicine have stirred up against me. For there have been not only those who have loaded me by name with the heaviest calumnies and have reviled me with diverse reproaches, but also like harpies and scoundrelly thieves, the doors of my laboratory, having been opened with false key, they took away with their dirty hands by this nefarious daring preparations made at great expense and manuscripts which had been collected with much labour, and the heaviest grief having welled up in my heart at the loss of such precious belongings, they cast me into a most dangerous illness. But what then? Favoured by the divine will, I recovered, and with renewed strength returned to my ordinary labours. And when I learned that it had become known to all that I was the author of the Tirocinium Chemicum, I thought it consorted with my dignity that I should recognise it, that I should cut out some parts, substitute improvements, and communicate everything brought into better order to you, amiable reader, as you now see in friendly fashion. The result was an expanded new version of his book, published in Paris in 1612. Sadly, only 2 copies of this are currently known. That's another one for me to watch out for. However, aside from the preface, the text of the book was soon pirated as well and republished, and I have a copy of this text from 1615. The different editions known to Paterson were summarised in a chart, and that's shown here. And over the years, I've acquired a few of these different editions as well. Those are the ones shown in red. There are also a couple of minor variant issues that could be added, but more importantly, there was an edition unknown to Paterson, a translation of the original first edition of 1610. This appeared in Utrecht in 1614. This means that we can add a new entry to Paterson's scheme. I don't have that one either, by the way, and also another one to watch out for. One of the most significant editions was a French translation, though prepared by Began himself, and this appeared in 1615 in Paris. Paterson calls it a very rare book and an outstanding publication. Whilst reasonably rare, in addition to my own, there are 2 other copies in London and the Ferguson copy in Glasgow, and several other copies in other countries. Both Roy Neville and William Cole had copies in their libraries, which is interesting since Cole generally collected later material. It also featured in Reed's Humour and Humanism, again described as extremely rare. After many other editions appeared, overseen by different editors after Began's death, finally, in 1669, the book was translated into English. And it seems to be a translation from the 1612 Latin edition. I found mine at an auction in the States about 15 years ago. The book features an attractive outer engraved title page. The translator is known from another work to be Richard Russell. Paterson points out that Russell could easily have done a better job, since he'd used the text over 50 years out of date. Ignoring the later editors who'd also improved the work, Russell did not even use the latest French version prepared by Began himself. He does not even mention that the author was long since dead. Nonetheless, I think it is still a beautiful book, and I'm delighted to have a copy. But interestingly, maybe it's not entirely true to say that this was the first English version of that book. This way, I think. That way, sorry, yeah. This is not necessarily the first English edition of Began's work. In 2010, I noticed an interesting item about to be due to feature in an American auction. And it was simply described thus: an early chemistry broadside, chemistry displayed, London, printed by H. Hills for William Larner, and to be sold at his shop at the sign of the Blackmore near Bishopsgate, 1648. Broadside on watermark laid paper, untrimmed, measuring approximately 15 by 11 inches. Paper is toned and chipped with flattened folds, with contemporary handwritten brackets in ink, matte burn, near fine, an early chemistry pedagogic chart. So that was it. So there was no hint what it actually was, but I thought, since I was extremely interested in any 17th century English chemistry items, I was drawn to this, but I thought surely I should be able to work out what it was. I first wondered whether it might not be a table from a book, although this seemed highly unlikely since the printer, publisher and date were all given, and there did not seem to be any evidence of it ever having been bound into a book. It didn't take me long until I realised that actually it was a hitherto unrecognised partial translation of Began's work. The sheet shows the operations used in chemistry in the form of a chart, and additional text gives an explanation of each. The layout of the operational divisions is exactly the same as the chart first included by Began in the French edition of 1615. This is the chart from that French edition of 1615. And ignoring the top part for the moment, the layout is precisely the same, as we can see in a comparison in detail here. So this shows the section of chemistry displayed at the top, with a chart from the 1615 French edition below, and the layout of the procedures is absolutely identical. This continues throughout the whole scheme. And the text, though, that appears in the broadsheet is clearly not in the fold-out chart. However, it is lifted from the text in the main body of the book. It is almost a word-for-word translation. This is from the start of the chart, including the 3 principles into which substances can be broken down: mercury, any volatile component; sulfur, the oily, flammable principle there; and salt. This is an earthy component that doesn't change with further heat. So it is exactly from this Tyrrhenium. And even the descriptions of the processes are lifted from the main text. And here we've seen the process corrosion, amalgamation, and precipitation with the same text in the table and in the book. The English translation in this is completely different from that used in Richard Russell's translation that appeared in 1669. So it is clearly, therefore, it represents a completely new, partial version of Begann's work, and hence we should add a new entry to Patterson's chart. The chart and some other editions of Begann's text are now on display outside in the foyer, together with a few of my favourite 16th century texts illustrating the purification of mercury. And I hope you'll be able to join me there, perhaps with a glass of wine. Thank you.
This is one of those days when I'm so delighted to have the job that I have. You have taught us, made us laugh, and shared your passion with us, and it's been a real joy. Thank you so much, Peter, for that. Peter has very kindly said he's got time for a few questions before we go out and then join him for a glass of wine and then to look at the books. Would anyone like to kick us off?
Sorry. Okay, thank you. Oh, we have a thing. I can use the thing so that everyone can hear you. I have to throw this at you, and you have to catch it. Oops, sorry, bad throw. And as long as oh, there are. Look at that.
Okay, if you were to live at the end of this century, or I don't know, at the beginning of the next century, are there any books that you would deem worthy to spend the whole summer working and washing dishes to buy the book?
Sorry, are you saying if any ones from more recently published? Are you saying, or more recent ones? 20th century. I'm really not so much into the 20th century. Yes, 19th is pushing it, but there are certainly some in the 19th century. 20th century.
A signed copy of a Wothers textbook.
Actually, you can get them on eBay really cheap. I'd have to think about 20th century. That's absolutely stumped me with that question, I'm afraid. Yes, I don't know what I'd get from the 20th century. Although, actually, no. I bought one recently. I did buy something. And this is actually, sorry, I better come back here. This is quite exciting. I'm getting very excited again. This is because, as you all know, next year is the 150th anniversary of the periodic table. Okay, and a very generous alumnus of St Catherine's has recently provided us with a copy of the first edition of Mendeleev's textbook, in which the first ever periodic table was published. So this is extremely exciting, and a lot of other periodic table material as well. So we're hoping that we'll be able to have an exhibition of that. So I've been planning some material to celebrate the anniversary of the periodic table, but one item for this actually does creep into the 20th century, and this was the discovery of atomic number. And so this is what makes one element different from another. And this is an absolutely beautiful piece of work, and it was by Henry Moseley from 1914, 1916, around that time. So I actually bought a copy of, this was a publication in a journal, and I don't normally go for journals, but this was the original issue in its original wrappers of this particular thing that for me represents the end of the development of the periodic table. Of course, it's ongoing with new elements being made every now and then that last, fractions of a second, but this is the thing that suddenly they knew how it all worked. And so that was something that I bought recently, and that probably is you'd have to work all summer for to buy, I suppose.
That's a great question.
Yes.
Does he have to throw that to the next?
He does, yes, exactly. So everyone's going to be volunteering now, yes.
As you throw the question, here at the front. Okay, now you're doing it.
Thanks so much for that really engaging lecture, and I have two quick questions. First, in how many instances are later editions of the chemistry books that you own are actually more rare and valuable than the first editions? And secondly, sort of to what extent do the really rare books never actually make it to the internet market or to auction houses because they're instantly snapped up by internal client lists? And so in that sense, is the internet a bit overhyped in its ability to find the really, really rare stuff?
Okay, I'm going to take your second question first because I'm still thinking about the first one. I mean, you're right that occasionally things get snapped up, and I'm pleased to say that there are a few dealers that will contact me. Usually these are not very, very expensive items because they know I'm always broke, but nonetheless, I mean, so it can happen, yes. But I really do think that actually you can just find all sorts of amazing things. I mean, even on eBay, I'm slightly more skeptical and cautious about eBay, especially since I bought something from there once that was stolen and had the police contacting me. But as one of my book dealer friends says, he says, every good book has been stolen at least once. So, yeah, so that I'm slightly cautious about eBay because also, I mean, these are not professional dealers. They don't know how to collate the books and so on. But even then, with other dealers, you still don't know if something's correct. So, but you just need to keep your eyes open is the thing. As to second editions being, I don't know for chemistry. I'm sure something will come to me later. But I mean, first there's an appeal to the first edition, but often things do yes. Second edition of Boyle's Properties of Air, for instance. So this is the one where Boyle's law is first mentioned. I mean, that one seems to be more highly valued than the first edition. But having said that, I mean, I've got a copy of that, which is nice, but actually I'd like to find the first edition, which I think is probably more rare.
We've got time for one more question.
Mark.
Peter, do you like annotated books, or do you have any?
I have some. So, I mean, actually, in sort of one sense, I mean, I like the purity of a unmarked, unblemished book. But then again, I think more recently I've begun to appreciate that actually the annotations can be really fun, really significant, and increase the value. But of course, I mean, we don't encourage everyone to write on the books now, and yet, these are now things that are sort of sought after. I remember passing on one, and this was an item on eBay, and it was, I was thinking, it was about £500. It was actually by Richard Russell, the translator of the book that I was talking about. It was of Gaber's work, but I didn't buy this. It was heavily annotated though, and I know Jenny Rampling is kicking me for not getting that one, for instance, because it would have been really, really good for her. And so I think, yes, I have some, and I have one of my copies of work by Boyle, for instance, is interleaved, and there's lots of notes, and these are quite fun. But on the whole, I mean, yeah, whatever comes up really. If it's something really rare, and if it's with annotations, then fine. So.
Can I first of all say that Peter is very kind again to stay a little longer with the glass behind the wall, and also a real treat for us to see some of his books on display. But secondly, and most importantly, can you join me in saying a very, very warm thank you.
Thank you.